Welcome to Micro-Digressions. Hopefully welcome back to Micro-Digressions. This is Spencer Case, and I've got a new motto now for the podcast. I'm going to call Micro-Digressions the podcast where we believe that the meandering path is the straightest way to knowledge. How about that? Should it be wisdom? I'll fine-tune that, but you get the idea. Now I've got a nice tagline for the podcast. So I'm going to start doing these introductions before I jump into the main interview. First, I want to do a plea for promotion. I haven't done this in the past. I haven't mentioned this in the past, but I would really appreciate it if you enjoy this podcast, that you would go ahead and subscribe on YouTube or follow on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, wherever you listen to your podcasts. There's no price for doing so. I'm not asking you for any kind of money or support or anything like that. I will point out that I put thousands of dollars of my own money into this podcast. I do all the editing myself. I do all the promotion myself, and sometimes read multiple books to prepare for each episode. I'm doing it for free. I'm not asking anything from you, but I would appreciate it. We've gotten very good reviews from the people who have listened to the podcast, but the audience is still small. So I'd appreciate it if you do what you could to promote it, if only by hitting subscribe on YouTube. Oh, I also want to say the music that you hear in the trailer and in this introduction is from my friend Jeremy Money. That last name is Mohney. You can find him on Bandcamp. He does his own original swing music, and he's allowed me to use his music on the podcast. I'm a big fan. He does really excellent work and is very unappreciated, or underappreciated, I should say. Those who know his music generally do love it, as I do. So go ahead and check out Jeremy Money's music, if you would. About the current episode, I've got a few things to notify you about. So one is that there were some technical difficulties with getting this one recorded, and my guest video cuts out halfway through. You'll notice that if you watch the YouTube version of it, but if you're just listening, of course, you won't notice it. The other thing is, you're just checking out the podcast for the first time to see what it's about. This isn't exactly a representative episode. It's different. It's different on purpose. I wanted to do something different with this one. So the first reason it's different is that the subject is a work of literature, Paradise Lost, and I've never done an episode with that subject before. And just a couple of facts I'll say about it that don't come up in our conversation. And one is that Milton dictated this while he was blind. So he was born with sight and then lost it, and he was dictating the poem while he was blind, which is stunning because it's got all this visual imagery in it. And in a way, it's kind of analogous to Beethoven composing the Ninth Symphony after losing his hearing. It's another one of these not only aesthetic masterpieces, but sort of a triumph of the human spirit over human adversity and limitations. And so I find that very admirable. It's also interesting that Milton added more words to the English language than Shakespeare. Among them, pandemonium. You know, like if there's traffic, somebody will say, it's pandemonium out here. So that means that that was the capital of hell, meaning all demons. So I didn't know that, or at least if I had, I'd forgotten about it. And he also was the first person to coin the word space in the sense of outer space, way back in the 17th century. So that's impressive. Okay, so my guest is also different from a normal guest. He's my friend, Brother Dunstan Enzor. He's not my brother. He is a monk and a theologian. And I've usually only had philosophers and I think one commentator on the podcast before. This is the first time I've had a monk and a theologian. Given that is his background, even though I think he does have a degree in philosophy from CU Boulder, he clearly has a lot of philosophical interests. You know, his focus is going to be more on matters of theology and Catholic doctrine, as you would expect somebody of that background to be. I still think it's a very philosophically rich conversation and an interesting one, but it might not be to every audience member's interests, right? It's going to be a bit different. You could definitely do a drinking game here and take a shot every time Dunstan says the word patristic, but it's a great conversation, and I hope you enjoy it. Brother Dunstan Enzor, welcome to Micro-Digressions.
Thank you so much, Spencer. It's great to be here. Thanks for the invite.
You're a monk at St. Anselm Abbey in, I believe, New Hampshire. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Say a little bit about what that is like for those who don't have any familiarity with this, I don't know, unusual line of work.
Sure. So, my name is Brother Dunstan, as Spencer said, and I am a monk of the Order of Saint Benedict. We are a Roman Catholic religious order, a monastic order that traces its origins to Saint Benedict of Nursia, a monk who lived in northern Italy from approximately 480 to 540. So the Benedictine tradition, as it exists in the Roman Catholic Church in the 21st century, is a 1500-year monastic tradition. There are Benedictine monasteries all over the world. Many Benedictine monks, maybe most Benedictine monks historically, have simply followed the way of life as described in the rule, which is a way of life of prayer and work. The traditional Benedictine motto is ora et labora, prayer and work. My own congregation, my community, is part of a congregation called the American Cassinese Congregation, and we were founded in the 19th century when mostly monks from Germany came over to the United States with large immigrant populations, and most of those communities were established to run schools or to run parishes. So there are actually a significant number of Benedictine-sponsored colleges and universities in the United States, and one of them is my community, St. Anselm College in Manchester, New Hampshire. So the monks of my community perform a variety of roles at St. Anselm College. Some of us, like myself, are on the faculty. I serve on the theology faculty, completed my doctorate in historical theology at Boston College in 2024, and other monks have served in everything from vice presidential roles to working in the library to, all kinds of stuff on campus. So that in a nutshell is what we do.
Yeah, not just retreating into a cave and praying and or something like that.
That's right. There are many different forms of the quote unquote Benedict option, and some of them involve going into caves and retreating from the world, and others are much more actively engaged.
This is a little bit of a curveball, but I was wondering, could you regale my audience with your 15 minutes of fame story from 10 years ago?
Do you mean the airline thing?
I mean the airline thing. Yes, of course.
Okay, great. So a little bit of history here. Spencer and I have known each other for a pretty long time. We met in 2013 through a mutual acquaintance in Boulder, Colorado, Jason Potter, who is on the philosophy faculty at the University of Colorado Boulder. Spencer and I met at a film watching event at Jason's flat. Spencer is a fascinating interlocutor, and is very open about his views on a variety of matters, and sought to dissuade me from entering monastic life at this first meeting. Made a very strong argument against it, but I persevered anyway, and I entered as a postulant at the monastery of Christ in the Desert, and I was there for about 3.5 years. That's a long story. The community is a very complex place, but one of the interesting things that happened there that Spencer has referred to as my 15 minutes of fame, if I can remember the story, I think it was in 2014. Christ in the Desert has always had a large number of international vocations, and there was a monk, Brother John Baptist Zico, who was from Malawi, and he got stranded in Malawi. And if I remember the story correctly, he got stranded because his airline had canceled his return ticket from Malawi, claiming that it was booked fraudulently. But I had booked it for him with the Abbey credit card, and didn't really understand where that was coming from. So called United and spent a lot of time on the phone with them, and they refused to fix the problem. And subsequently, we had reached out to a number of media outlets that sort of do this thing where they sort of interface on behalf of stranded travelers with airline companies, and one of them was a column that no longer runs, but it was the Haggler, I think, at the New York Times, guy named David, really really nice guy, and he took an interest in the story, and he wrote this story about a monk getting stranded, and then he interviewed me for the story. And I guess one of the things I said in the interview was that I had become really angry with the airline customer service representative, and he was fascinated by that. He was like, "Well, what's it like when a monk gets angry?" And so I think I sort of like attempted to sort of recount what it was like when a monk gets angry, and so he published the piece, and it just blew up. I mean, it was all over the place.
Tell them what you said to the airline.
I can't. What can you remind me?
Yes. You
Okay.
said, "I love you. God bless you. I'll pray for you, but you have not been helpful."
That's right. Yes, I will pray for you. God bless you. You have not been helpful. Yeah, yeah, yeah. They were. Yeah. So I'm sure the column is still online. So Christ in the desert, stranded monk, that kind of thing. But anyway, yeah. So it was, it was those are my 15 minutes of fame, as Spencer says.
I'm sure that columnist was delighted to have you deliver a line like that. And I'll say, I've enjoyed our conversations very much over the years, and I think I'm glad you persevered in your current path. It seems like the monastic life is a good fit for you in a way that it would not be, I think, for most people. I think that seems right.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. And Spencer and I have, of course, continued our long philosophical and theological and artistic conversations over the years. I don't know if I've ever told you this, but you visited me more than anyone else when I was in the monastic desert of New Mexico. I think you came out a total of 4 times. So
4 times, that's right. Yeah,
yeah,
and I love those trips too. I love those trips.
nice.
Pleasure is mine. Well, to our feature presentation. It's a little bit more of a longer introduction than usual, but I think circumstances justify it. So I'll say a little bit about Paradise Lost, why I think this is a text each of us would have things to say about. Part of what drew me to the idea of doing a podcast on this is just about the humanities in general, about this kind of high literature and what place it has in an education. Why is it valuable? So with AI and then just various things going on at the university, it seems topical. It seems something that's been on my mind lately. And I've noticed I've tended to do what a lot of my professors have done, of specialize in my reading, read just stuff that I'm writing papers on. And I don't want to be too narrow in that way. I want to recover my love for literature that I had when I was a teenager and in my 20s and stuff. So it's been a while since I tried to crack a new great work that I hadn't done before. So that's one reason I was drawn to this text. And then also, I just think there are a lot of interesting issues here. There's stuff you can sink your philosophical or theological teeth into. He says at the very first paragraph, what he wants to do is to justify the ways of God to man. I take that to mean that he's offering us a theodicy, right? And so I want to kind of unpack that and see whether he succeeds in this, whether there's a kind of an argument that's being offered to us here. So I'm interested in that. I'm interested as well in whether he's giving us a general theory of evil. I think he does. And I'm trying to decide whether it's a distinct theory of evil from St. Augustine's view, which we can talk about, or whether you can translate one into the terms of the other. I'm not really sure what I think about that. And then there are just a variety of other issues about the fall and the nature of God and all of this that I think are intriguing. And so those are the things that I find interesting about this.
Great. Yeah. I appreciate that introduction. I first encountered Paradise Lost when I was an undergraduate. I was just kind of reading my way through a lot of sort of classical literature and medieval literature. I was an English major at the University of Colorado as an undergraduate, and I had really fallen in love with Dante. And I remember, had done an independent study on Dante with a professor I really liked, and we had sort of compared different editions and the translations and things like that. And I think it was maybe he who suggested that I might read Milton. And so I read Milton and did not did not love it the way that I loved Dante. Really, really struggled with Milton. I would even say, didn't really understand what the poem was about, compared to Dante. Even though they're similar in some ways, Dante is himself the protagonist throughout the Divine Comedy, and he's led through the three, the three celestial places: hell, purgatory, and heaven. First by Virgil, and then by other guides. Milton is really, really different. Obviously, he's in the background the whole time. Unlike Dante, Satan is a major character in Paradise Lost. That was something that I didn't understand the first time I read it. I want to be clear, I didn't find it offensive or anything like that. I just didn't understand what that was all about. I think I was reading the first time I did my Milton study. I did the Norton Critical Edition, which of course includes all of this sort of extra historical literature about the text. And I remember there was this one by, I think it was William Blake, who said that Milton was of the devil's party without knowing it, or something like that. And, was just, that just sort of confirmed me in my sense of like, who is this guy? What is this about? I don't understand this at all. I had a really different experience reading it this time, than I did before. I just, we'll get into it, obviously, but, it was a really different poem for me reading it now than it was, 25 years ago or whatever it was.
There are certain details here that really leap out, that like those were really nice flourishes that had they been left out, you wouldn't have missed it. You wouldn't have known it wasn't there. But really details that elevate this, and I really think of this as almost as like the great 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 grandfather of like Lord of the Rings or some high kind of fantasy. It's got kind of that sort of sweeping cosmic scope to it. And so there are details that draw me in on a literary level. So, for example, he describes Mammon, the demon Mammon, like even before the fall, when he was in heaven, he was looking more down at heaven's golden streets than up at God. I thought, oh, that is a really nice detail to include. And by the way, I should just say what he does here, and you can tell me whether you think this is a fair encapsulation, but he takes really the very, very early cosmic events of Christianity, about which there are only a few verses in the Bible. There's really not that much written about the stuff he's talking about. The war in heaven, the fall, the Garden of Eden. That's not that much in the either the New or the Old Testament about those events, but he sort of expands them and elaborates them and shows all of these sorts of symmetries and sort of compresses the entire Christian story into these events, which is itself an achievement. But then he elaborates them in such a brilliant way. So, for example, when the serpent tempts Eve, you've got this talking serpent. What do that's weird. But he says, wow, I chose this. I was just a normal snake, and then I tried this fruit, and now I can talk. Just imagine what this could do for you, this fruit. That's a really brilliant detail to add.
Yeah, I think you said a lot there that I think is really important for us as we get started with this. The thing that I kind of want to jump on that you said, something that I spent a lot of time really working my way through as I was reading the poem for our conversation today. You talked about Milton's elaboration of the biblical material, especially the stuff at the very, what in the theological tradition we would call the protology. So if eschatology is the study of last things, then protology is the study of first things. And Milton certainly is working in a biblical idiom when he talks about protology, but it's not just a biblical idiom. And I think this is something that Milton himself perhaps is at times maybe a little unintentionally misleading here. I mean, he's coming at this material very much from a Reformed perspective. And so he's constantly emphasizing the Bible and the interpretation of the Bible. All of that's fine. The thing that I think has to be pointed out is that Milton is highly versed in the extra-biblical theological tradition, both the ancient tradition, which in my field we would call the patristic writers, the patristic theologians. And patristic is just a $10 word that just means, it refers to the fathers of the church. So patristic writers would include everyone from people like Saint Irenaeus of Lyon to Saint Justin Martyr, the apologists, who were very, very versed in the writings of Plato and the Neoplatonists. Also people like Saint Augustine, Saint Ambrose of Milan. It's very clear that Milton is highly versed not only in the Latin patristic tradition, but also in the Greek patristic tradition. So to mention something and to go into a little bit more detail with something that Spencer just said, if we look at the very, very beginning of the Bible in Genesis 1, so a pretty standard translation here, the Revised Standard Version, the Second Catholic Edition published by Ignatius Press, chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and there was evening and there was morning, the first day. And then we get the creation of the firmament, which is separating the waters from the waters. And then we go to verse 8, and God called the firmament heaven. And there was evening and there was morning, a second day. So I'm not going to run through the whole thing, but we get light, and when we get the creation of the firmament, and by extension, the creation of heaven. All of this is really important because there is a very, very important tradition in which everything that has been created is created during that sequence and after that sequence. So, for example, take the angels. So, Saint Augustine says in, I think it's, The City of God, Book 11, Chapter 8, he takes up this question of when the angels are created. And he says, when sacred scripture speaks of the creation of the world, nothing explicit is said about whether or in what order the angels were created. But if they were not omitted altogether, they were signified either by the word heaven, where scripture says, "In the beginning God made heaven and the earth," or more probably by the word light, the light of which I have been speaking. And St. Augustine gives a number of arguments for why we should understand those references in Genesis to light and then to heaven to include things like angels. The sort of deep theological logic of what Augustine is getting at here is that it's desirable for various reasons to say that the entire totality of creation begins to come into being in these opening chapters of Genesis. And in particular, not to allow for the possibility that any creations exist before Genesis 1:1. Why? Well, a big reason is a fellow by the name of Origen of Alexandria, who lives from about 185 to 254. He's a very important early Christian theologian. But most theologians who write about Origen today, and most theologians who've written about Origen for the last 1800 years or so, would say that Origen holds to this theory of a pre-existent angelic fall, so that the angels fall before Genesis 1:1. And it's the angelic fall before Genesis 1:1 that gives rise to the creation of the physical world. So God's motivation for creating everything that we see around us has something to do with that angelic fall. And if you're interested in reading about that, that's in Origen's systematic treatise on first principles. He also deals with it in a lot of his biblical interpretations. Now, if we look at sort of what we have from Milton here, and we can ask, what's he doing? Is he following the Latin patristic tradition as exemplified by Augustine, or is he doing something else? And the answer is he's doing something else. For Milton, and this isn't just me, this is really, really clear. We can go into some texts if you'd like, Spencer. The fall of the angels in Milton precedes the creation narrative. And this is, I'm going to argue throughout this conversation that we have today, I won't give you everything I think now about this, but this is not just a kind of like deviation from Roman Catholic theology for the sake of, attacking the Roman Catholic Church. Even though, Milton does that a lot in Paradise Lost and elsewhere. There are all of these little sort of jabs at Roman Catholicism, which is fine. He's a Reformation era writer. There was a lot of polemic going on. I actually think that what Milton is up to here is something quite a bit more interesting and theologically structural than that. I think he really thinks that it's important for Satan, when Satan gets expelled from heaven, it's very, very important that that first expulsion from paradise, the title of the poem is Paradise Lost. Obviously, this is referring primarily to Adam and Eve, but there is also a sense in which this applies to Satan. And not just to Satan, but to all of the evil angels who have, in a sense, lost paradise. We hear this story when one of the good angels recounts it at a later time in Paradise Lost. But as the poem opens, this is very much where we are. The demons have fallen for 9 days. They've been pushed out of heaven. They're lying in the lake of fire. And all of this is, to sort of go back to where we started with this is Milton sort of taking the biblical data, but sort of interpreting it through the lens of the earlier patristic tradition, and giving us a poem where everything is sort of really sort of beautiful and elegant and sanded down. And it just seems like a compelling narrative. But if we start to sort of pick it apart, there's a lot that he's doing here.
If I could zoom out a bit here, the poem ends up focusing quite a lot on the character of Satan, and some of the romantics like Blake and then other later romantic writers thought that Milton was, maybe without knowing it, really on the devil's side here. I don't think that's true, but it is. I think it may be the case that he ended up making Satan more compelling than he intended to, and it's worth thinking about why that is. Why Satan seems so vivid, and God seems I don't know, like this sort of divine bureaucrat just issuing out commands or something like this. I don't know. C.S. Lewis in his preface to Paradise Lost blames this on God's anthropomorphism. I don't think that's it. I don't think that's getting at the heart of this. I think it might just be that there's something about, like, well, look, when you think of what's narratively compelling, you know, if you ever read books about writing novels, they tell you the main character has to have some kind of suffering. There's got to be some kind of tragedy or struggle or something. And you don't really have that for God the Father, right? I mean, he's perfect and unchanging. I suppose he has interests that can sort of be thwarted temporarily, but he's not vulnerable to tragic fate in the way contingent beings are. And so I think that might be one of the reasons why Satan ends up being more compelling. Another thing is, and I wonder what you think about this, is that you can sort of see God reflected in Satan in a strange way. You sort of see by exactly what's wrong with Satan, you can see what's supposed to be good about God. Maybe this is, I'm going to use one of your words, maybe there's an apophatic thing going on. You can't really positively describe God, but you can see the divine's absence in contingent beings that fall short of him. What do you think of that idea?
I think that's an interesting idea. I mean, the apophatic tradition, the idea of the way of negation, that we can't know God in this world in a positive way because of the limitation of our minds, the limitation of our language, God's own intrinsic hiddenness. I mean, I think of that famous line from the book of, the prophet Isaiah, truly you are a hidden God. The apophatic theology is many centuries older than Milton. The first apophatic writer is probably Dionysius the Areopagite, or I should say pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite. But the tradition gets taken up by St. Thomas Aquinas and other people. And, you can't say positive things about God. There's a limit to the cataphatic tradition in theology, our ability to make positive statements. But we can know God, I think as Aquinas says, we can know God in this world and in this life primarily not by studying what he is, but by studying what he is not. God doesn't have a body. God is atemporal. God is not limited by a place. And if you take all of those no statements about what God isn't, if you kind of turn them around, you can kind of like squeeze some knowledge out of those statements. So apophatic theology is ultimately a quest for knowledge about God. It's a different method. Your application of that apophatic idea to Paradise Lost, I think, is pretty fruitful. The idea that Milton is maintaining a certain prudential distance from God himself. He does sometimes bring us right up to the throne. We see various decrees from God in Paradise Lost. But I think you're right. I mean, I think I'm pretty sympathetic to your reading. I mean, Satan and Satan's behavior. There are a lot of lines that we get from Satan that seem to be sort of pointing towards deeper realities, and Milton seems to rely on us to to be able to make those distinctions. Line 217 to 18, Satan says that he doesn't like that malice served but to bring forth infinite goodness. Well, I mean, this is, of course, a very familiar biblical and theological idea, right? The idea that God doesn't will evil, but that he allows it in order to bring forth a greater good. The demons are really sort of literate, systematic theologians here. They are aware of this idea. They don't like this idea. They resent the fact that God is going to bring forth good from their malice. But by criticizing this idea, they kind of point toward an idea that Milton maybe wants to highlight and to emphasize and to kind of uplift. And so in that sense, yeah, I mean, Satan, we could find probably a lot of examples of places where Satan, by saying something or doing something which we're supposed to disapprove of, is sort of actually kind of telling us something about God. I would add, to that, we talked about Satan's role in this sort of, pre-Genesis 1:1 created order, which includes the angels and heaven and maybe other things. But one of the things that I think is kind of structuring this poem is the way in which Satan and Adam, each of whom experience a kind of exile, a kind of expulsion. Satan gets expelled from paradise, and then Adam gets expelled from Eden. And Satan gets expelled from Eden as well. But the two of them are kind of similar in this sense. Satan seems to think of himself as the head of this, this pre-Genesis 1:1 order. But there's a debate with the good angel Abadiel, where Abadiel tells Satan, no, it's the Son of God who's the head of this first order. You aren't. I know you think you are, but you're not actually. So, Satan's misbehavior is sort of, in some ways, illuminating the goodness of the good angels. It's also illuminating perhaps the goodness of Adam. I'm sure we'll get to some passages earlier, but think about the way in which Satan's response to expulsion is just completely different from Adam's response to expulsion. And I think that structure and that contrast is a big part of what is giving this poem its moral weightiness.
One of the more compelling parts is in book 4, where Satan has escaped from hell and he's in Eden, and he's plotting the deception of Eve and all of this. But he has like a moment of like self-doubt. He's taken a wrong turn, and he's seen the beauty of Eden and how it contrasts with the hell he's just come out of, and he's considering whether he should repent, even at this very, very late hour. And he decides against it. And he offers himself this interesting rationalization, which is that if God were to forgive me, I would do this same thing again. And then I would fall to an even lower place, maybe a place so low that hell would look like a heaven compared to where God would send me next. And that's when he comes to this famous line that, evil be thou my good. It could also be true. It could be true that if he were given a second chance, he would blow it just like he did the last time. But it's interesting because Adam, responded differently, and God kind of mitigated the sentence in a way, at least in the poem, by giving him a vision of of what the next step was in his plan and how he was going to redeem mankind. But it's interesting that he's presented even after having fallen as being a person who is capable of having qualms, capable of self-reflection, and is not entirely evil. Now, notice this I think is kind of Augustinian. So, and he at different points, I think in book one he says this too, that the various demons, there's still little fragments of light from when they were angels still in them, and if you take the metaphysical view seriously, then there would have to be for them to exist at all.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. Some of the passages that you've taken us to in this long speech in book four, you specifically mentioned the, his the sort of "I would do it again" quality. I think it's worth kind of drilling down into that. So this is 468. But heaven's free love dealt equally to all, Satan asks. Be then his love accursed, since love or hate to me alike it deals eternal woe. Nay, cursed be thou, since against his thy will chose freely what it now so justly rues. Me miserable, which way shall I fly? Infinite wrath and infinite despair? Which way I fly is hell, myself and hell, and in the lowest deep, a lower deep still threatening to devour me opens wide, to which the hell I suffer seems a heaven. There's a lot going on in those passages, but the first thing that kind of jumps out at me is this emphasis on the freedom of the will. Milton, at every level of this poem, is just safeguarding that constantly. It's another one of his sort of, if you look at the literature on Milton, it's, the scholars are going to say that he's really heterodox here when looked at read against both Augustine, but maybe more importantly, when read against Calvin. Milton seems to go through something of a Calvinist phase earlier in his life, but by the time he gets to Paradise Lost, he's more of an Arminian. And Arminianism is this movement within the overall sort of Reformation of Christianity movement that emphasizes the freedom of the will and really pushes back against Calvinist theories of predestination. Milton could have written this poem from a predestination perspective and just said, well, God ordained that all of these things would happen. Adam's sin was preordained. There's a lot of Catholic theology that goes in that direction. There's a lot of Calvinist and Protestant theology broadly that goes in that direction. But that's not what Milton does here. Milton emphasizes God's freedom. He has some speeches that he gives to God, God the Father, in which any concept of necessity being imposed upon God is just totally rejected by Milton. So who would impose necessity on God? Well, one person would be St. Anselm of Canterbury. St. Anselm thinks that the incarnation is actually necessary, that God can't forgive the sins that go back to original sin by any means other than the incarnation, because any sin, the sort of gravity of a sin is measured against the being against whom it is committed. So God is an infinite being. So a sin committed against God is by definition worse than a sin committed against you, Spencer, or me, because we're not infinite beings. So since humans have committed an infinite sin against an infinite being, the only one who can reconcile and atone for that is the infinite being himself. And that, in a nutshell, is Anselm's argument for why the incarnation is actually necessary in the philosophical sense. Milton just has a total allergy to that kind of thinking. He just totally rejects anything that sounds like that. He really emphasizes the will of God, the freedom of God to will one thing or another. And this has its own sort of history and its own problems. It's something that comes up in Roman Catholic theological history. It's something that comes up in Protestant theological history.
Yeah, I just to anticipate some of this, right? If God's will is not necessary, then it's contingent. It's not totally explained by his essence. That seems to make God dependent on his parts, and it seems to make some kind of arbitrariness in God that I could see how some people would be allergic to that.
I used to have conversations about this with a friend from Boulder, from whom I rented a room. And he grew up in Iran, and so I would sort of come at this from a Christian perspective, and he would come at this from an Islamic perspective. But we used to have this discussion about, like, if God decides to commit a sin, is it a sin? And there's a strain of thought. There's a strain of thought in Islam, there's a strain of thought in Protestant Christianity, there's a strain of thought in Roman Catholicism that says, no, if God chooses to do something in his will, if God wills something, then what he wills is by definition good. There's another strain of thought, which is the dominant thought in Roman Catholicism. I can't speak to this issue in Protestant Christianity or Islam, but in Roman Catholic thought, we would want to balance affirmations of God's omnipotence, so his all-powerful will, with affirmations of his moral perfection and his omniscience. The divine qualities constitute a totality. And you referred to divine simplicity, an important dogma, a few minutes ago. When we think about what God wills, according to divine simplicity, like, what God wills is what God is. God doesn't will things that differ from his essence. And if we reduce God to his will, then we can end up, without really intending to, we can end up with a kind of monstrosity. Milton doesn't do that, I don't think, in this poem. In some ways, the pieces of that kind of voluntaristic conception of God are here, because he doesn't really say a whole lot that would place moral or other essential limitations on God's exercise of his freedom, and by extension, God's exercise of his power. So I would raise some concerns about that, but the poem is not really about that. And I don't see, I see that as like a background issue that we could talk about. But, I kind of want to bring this back to the discussion of Satan. Milton is safeguarding God's free will, but he's also safeguarding Satan's free will, and he's also safeguarding Adam's free will. In the Protestant tradition from which Milton is operating, according to all of the literature, Arminianism, grace is resistible. And that's different than Calvinism, where grace isn't resistible. So, all of the dramatic actors in this poem, especially, I think, for Milton, Satan and Adam, are people who could have acted in accord with grace, and they just didn't. And this speech that you've taken us to in Book 4 is really fascinating, because Satan is really clear that this isn't accidental. As you rightly say, he says that if he were to be placed in the same position again, he would do the same thing again. And why is this? Why is this?
This is, I think, at the very core of whether this theodicy succeeds or not, as I see it, because I don't think I have a clear conception of what it is that I'm completely free, and yet I would always behave this way. It seems like you're saying you're free and you're determined. It seems like Satan is saying both of those things. I chose it freely, and yet I'm determined by my nature to be prideful and to act this way and to rebel. I wonder if that, so first, is there a coherent conception of freedom that has both of these elements in it? That the element of it's up to me, and yet my nature determines me to be this way. And the second issue is, does this justify the ways of God to man? I mean, if God knew that Satan is like this, why did God created him? Why is he not responsible? Why is Satan's evil laid squarely at the feet of the created beings, Satan, and not God himself? I don't see clear answers to either of those questions.
Gosh, there's a lot there to unpack. So let me kind of place before you what I think his conception of freedom is. And then you can tell me if you find my reading of Paradise Lost on this point satisfactory, and then if I'm right about Milton, if you find Milton's argument satisfactory. So there's a couple layers there for you to respond to. But the tradition that Milton is responding to, this sort of Augustinian Calvinistic synthesis of the theology of grace and the theology of predestination, is something that Milton really doesn't like. He goes out of his way, for example, to distinguish between God the Father's foreknowledge and God the Father's predestination. There's a very, very long debate about the relationship between those things that goes back to the earliest theologians whose writings we still have. It's really, really fraught. In general, and I'm really going to oversimplify this, but in general, if we sort of take Augustine's interpretations of Paul's letter to the Romans as a starting point, Augustine's view is going to be that there are really only two options. You can be a slave to sin, or you can be a slave to Christ. And this is language that Paul uses. So if you're a slave to sin, you're totally subordinating your intellect to, your pursuit of pleasure, or your pursuit of illicit goods, or something like that. Your intellect is sort of working to get those things for you. So all of your higher faculties are being subordinated to your lower faculties. Being a slave to sin is a really sort of complicated state in life in which your higher faculties are subordinated to your lower faculties. On the other hand, if you are, a slave to Christ, then you are constantly responding to the grace that God has given. You are exercising your freedom to do what God has predestined you to do. That doesn't sound like freedom at all. That doesn't sound like freedom at all to many people. But for a writer like Augustine, that is the essence of freedom. You are living in accord with grace, which is sort of propelling you forward through life. You have a sort of upward spiritual trajectory. All of the created goods that you're using in such a way that they're ordered towards the one great good God himself. So even though it might seem at first glance that this isn't an exercise of freedom, this is how Augustine and writers who follow him really conceptualize the exercise of human freedom. This is the tradition that Milton doesn't agree with. Milton is in some ways, I would say, he's in some ways very kind of modern in his conception of freedom. He doesn't think that freedom is free if freedom is actualized only through corresponding or conforming to that which is willed by some higher power. He thinks that there needs to be some kind of like truly sort of free choice involved, some autonomous exercise of the will, the ancient philosophical world or something like that. I remember, Plato and other ancient philosophers thought that the planets were rational beings. And it's that quality of self-movement, whether it's exercised in a physical sense or a moral sense or an intellectual sense. This is really what makes a being free. In some ways, Milton seems to resemble that idea. But look at what Satan himself tells us. And I think we need to read this language that we've been looking at in Book 4. We need to read that through the prism of this language from Book 6. I'm in, 665. I'll go back to 655. We're in Eden, and Satan is sneaking up on Adam and Eve. Fanned with cool winds, save those who in their course melodious hymns about the sovereign throne alternate all night long. But not so waked Satan. So call him now. His former name is heard no more in heaven. He of the first, if not the first archangel, great in power, in favor and in preeminence, yet fraught with envy against the Son of God, that day honored by his great Father and proclaimed Messiah King anointed, could not bear through pride that sight and thought himself impaired. Deep malice thence conceiving and disdain, soon as midnight brought on the dusky hour, friendliest to sleep and silence, he resolved with all his legions to dislodge, and leave unworshipped, unobeyed the throne supreme, contemptuous, and his next subordinate awakening, thus to him in secret spake. And then the demons sort of continue their discussion. But note the rational motivation that Milton has ascribed to Satan here. Satan is motivated by envy against the Son of God, whom God the Father has sort of set up. Now, Milton's, we've talked about sort of Milton's various heterodoxies and the way he's sort of cherry-picking his way through the theological tradition. Milton's Christology is really weird. He says at one point that Jesus is exalted by God, more by merit than by birthright. And this would lead us, if we pursued it now, into a conversation about Milton's Christology, which many writers, including, this is the best work of literature I've read about Paradise Lost, Poole's study, Milton and the Making of Paradise Lost. But Poole, among many others, just argues that Milton is an out-and-out Arian. He does not believe, as we recite in the Nicene Creed, that Jesus is consubstantial with God the Father. of the same substance. Milton, seems to be a kind of, seems to believe that Jesus is created by God, although there are some important differences between Milton and what we know about Arius, but he does seem to regard Jesus as a kind of creation who is kind of being, lifted up, a la Philippians 2, the famous hymn in Philippians 2. Though he was in the form of God, Jesus did not deem equality with God something to be grasped at. Rather, he emptied himself and took the form of a slave, being born in the likeness of men. Though he was known to be of human estate, it was thus that he was humbled and obediently accepted death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every other name. Milton quotes that hymn from Philippians 2 a number of times in Paradise Lost, or alludes to it. And he really seems to think that God has kind of lifted up Jesus as a way of sort of rewarding his merit, because he finds that idea in the hymn in Philippians 2. In my tradition, Roman Catholicism, that would not be an Orthodox Christology or an Orthodox reading of Philippians 2. But again, Milton isn't claiming to be Catholic, so I don't want to judge him by my standards. But here, if you look at what Milton ascribes to Satan by way of a rational motivation, it's precisely that act of rewarding Jesus for his merit and lifting him up and exalting him that drives Satan absolutely nuts. So, given the time frame that we're talking about here, we know that this paragraph that I just read from book 5, starting at line 660, we know that this must happen during the pre-existence, pre-Genesis 1:1 period, because this is what arouses the envy of Satan, and this is what leads to the fall of the angels. So here, right before he embarks on his quest of actually, trying to corrupt Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, Satan is sort of rehearsing this motivation to himself. And we've heard about this, at another point in this poem. I just wanted to bring this up because it's particularly vivid and evocative here. So now I'm gonna turn this back to Spencer, and I'm gonna ask, do you buy Milton's concept of freedom?
I can imagine some beings are more inclined to envy than others, but it seems like there's got to be something there from the beginning. I mean, Michael doesn't act this way. Others who have the same freedom, Satan points this out himself. Others with the same freedom didn't choose this. And I have this sort of intuition that pushes toward, maybe it pushes toward free will skepticism. That's like, well, gee, there's got to be some explanation for why Lucifer did this. I don't think he's ever referred to as Lucifer, and Michael didn't. I find that puzzling. I do think it's interesting what the motive is, that it's envy. And I hadn't focused on this envy of the Son in particular. I thought it was just envy of God. And I thought the thing that rankled Satan was, he's the ontic silver medalist. He's, the top angel. So everything on the chain of being is below me. Everything, except one thing. And that's the thing that drives him nuts. It's also interesting. A lot of evil, we don't tend to think of envy as the worst evil. I think of cruelty as being the worst kind of vice a person can have.
I'm sympathetic to your reading. If you look at patristic commentaries on Matthew's gospel, especially the actions of Judas, the patristic writers, almost to a T, ascribe to Judas the motivation of envy, and the motivation of greed. It's only in John's gospel, I think, that Judas is said to be the person who's minding the money bag. But quite a number of patristic authors, when they're analyzing Judas's betrayal of Jesus in the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they'll take that datum from John about Judas holding the money bag, and they'll say, oh, he's motivated by money. This is all about greed. This is all about envy. And what's really interesting about that is the way that it lines up Judas's motivation with Satan's motivation. And again, I don't think any of this is accidental. Milton is a crazily well-read person. It's just sort of sifting through Paradise Lost and trying to figure out what his sources are and how he's sifting his way through the inherited material. Especially, if you turn to his his apologetic work on Christian doctrine. He's given that title the same title that Augustine gave to his work, De Doctrina Christiana, on Christian doctrine. But he's in some ways working in Augustine's shadow, but he clearly is differing from Augustine on many points. Milton is just astonishingly knowledgeable about this tradition. Even when we don't agree with him, he's generally worth paying attention to. He's a thoughtful guy, and this business of ascribing envy, to Satan as a rational motivation. I don't think this is. I don't really agree with Blake. I don't think that Milton is taking Satan's side here. I know there's a long history of other people saying that kind of thing. I think that tends to make hash of the moral logic of Paradise Lost, especially the sort of contrast with Adam. But the idea of Satan being motivated by envy is something that is really tying Milton to the earlier tradition in an interesting way. And as we've seen just in this conversation, Milton isn't always interested in following the earlier tradition. So when he is, he's worth paying attention to.
It's interesting that so much, a lot of really bad evil does come from envy, in particular envy over status. So I several years ago, I read this book that was a study of mass shootings in the U.S. called Stop the Killing by Catherine Schweit. She worked for the FBI, and then she wrote a book on mass shootings. And there's a profile of what the typical mass shooter is like. And one very common theme is these are people who feel like they've lost some kind of status. They lost a custody case. They were fired. And a lot of the most evil movements, like political movements in history, have this element of resentment from perceived lost status. Nazism and 20th century and 21st century Islamism come with this sense of insecurity, of we deserve to be in a more exalted place than we are, as a kind of engine for all sorts of other evils.
You had a nice image. It was like the Ontic silver medal or something like that.
The Ontic silver medalist, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's right. I mean, Abadiel, the good angel who resists, he doesn't go along with Satan. Milton I think he's working with like Revelation 12, but there's this aside in Revelation 12 that says a third of the angels went over to Satan's side. So Milton, he's got to get, a number of the angels with Satan, but he knows not all of them follow him. Now, and I can't remember who it was, someone made the point that you made that Milton, this scholar said, is not entirely convincing in distinguishing angels that decide to follow Satan from angels that don't. So I think you're in making that point. I just wanted to kind of signal that, like, yes, that's something that the scholars of Paradise Lost, at least some, have identified as a weakness. On your Ontic silver medal thing, what's kind of ironic about this is, if Abadiel is criticizing Satan for thinking that, you thought, Satan, that you were the head of the pre-Genesis 1:1 created order. But when you found out you weren't, you had a tantrum and you picked up your marbles and you went home, because you found out that the head of the pre-Genesis 1:1 created order is actually the Son. And again, Milton says all kinds of strange things because he's a non-Trinitarian Christian. We'd say he rejects the teaching of the Council of Nicaea that the Father and the Son are of the same substance. So trying to sort out exactly who the only begotten Son is for Milton is quite a chore, and I don't feel that I totally understand it.
Now, look, can I ask, could it have been, since he couldn't have been exalted for his deeds on earth, because the exaltation happened and that was the proximate cause of the war in heaven, because so it spurred Satan's envy. Could it have been that he was a highly exalted angel like Lucifer who agreed to sacrifice himself as part of the bigger plan, and was admitted into the Godhead, exalted in that way for the act of volunteering for the mission? Is that the idea?
So you said a lot there. I mean, the idea of so first of all, like, the idea of him as an angel, I've seen some debate in the literature about the extent to which Milton likes that idea. There is a title that the tradition, will sometimes ascribe to Jesus, the angel of good counsel. So there is a tradition, you find it in Origen of Alexandria and other ancient Christian writers, of thinking about, especially the pre-incarnate word of John's prologue. In the beginning there was the Word, and the Word was with God. There is a kind of tradition of thinking of him as an angel in that sense, but he's not an angel. Like even for Milton, like Milton doesn't want to reduce him to angelic status, because, to use your ontic, silver medalist thing, like whatever Jesus is an angel would not be, like, I think, nearly as high as what Milton wants him to be.
It is interesting how he's drawn to this, though. I have this. I want to ask you about the role of Satan in Christianity. It's hard to see why he's important. I mean, he's important in Paradise Lost as a symbol, as a symbol of evil, and maybe a reflection of God's goodness in a strange way. But he doesn't seem important. Like, he isn't. This isn't like Zoroastrianism, where you've got a god of light and a god of darkness, and they're just dueling it out like the light and the dark side of the Force in Star Wars or something. No, God is almighty in a way that precludes him from having that kind of a rival in any kind of monotheism. But then you've got Satan, but he doesn't really seem important because he's not the source of evil, because evil doesn't have any one source. It's just the absence of God or something like that. So you don't really need him to explain anything, right? You could say, well, it's just a historical fact that there was this angel or whatever. But I'm struggling to see his cosmic significance. If we can be tempted to do bad things, there was no one tempting him. He just was envious. So, and I guess a truly evil being would have to be superfluous, because once you have the idea of like a god of darkness and a god of light, then it seems like they need to balance each other out or something like that. You kind of need the one for the other. But true evil has got to be superfluous. Like, you don't need it. So you really don't need Satan. And I believe in earlier theological traditions, Satan had more of a role in, like, the atonement. The atonement had to do with God's defeating Satan and everything. And I think Anselm got rid of that. Is this right? Like, so now it seems like Satan is really kind of a superfluous character, that the central character to Paradise Lost doesn't really seem to matter that much in the grand story of Christianity.
You ask a great question, but it's a hard question to answer, because depending on the specific theologian we're looking at, we might see Satan described differently. But I think, maybe some broad contours might be helpful here. Satan is not, in any form of Orthodox Christianity, an equal principle to God. God is, in the beginning, God. God is uncreated, and Satan is a creature. That's not just the silver medalist. That's like, the so far down on the platform from God that, you can't even see him. There's an infinite number of grades that separate Satan and any creature ontologically from God. And that does kind of set up an interesting question for Milton, because Milton is, of course, in Paradise Lost, this whole poem is part of the story of the Christian reception and appropriation of classical epic forms. A few decades after this poem, Alexander Pope, who's read Milton and admires him, he translates the Iliad. And, Samuel Johnson says it's like the best translation of the Iliad he's ever read. But certainly, he's kind of, appropriating the classical epic form as well. He's giving Christian meanings to a lot of Homer's story that aren't in the original. That, in some ways, is a more straightforward version of what, of the appropriation of the ancient non-Christian epic than what Milton is doing. Because if you want to have a classical epic that is structured by Christianity, it's hard to do that, because the biblical story just doesn't seem to give you enough protagonists who are on an equal playing field. I mean, if you read the Iliad, if you open up, book one of the Iliad, the Greeks are at war with the Trojans, And if you've never come to the text before, you're like, well, there are champions on both sides. You've got, Hector and you've got Achilles, and you've got, among the gods, you've got Zeus and you've got, Hera, and you've got Athena, and so on and so forth. I mean, like, so they're kind of equally stacked on both sides. It's hard for biblical and theological Christianity to appropriate that form because that's not what the tradition says. There's just no symmetry between God and his creation. His creation can rebel, but his creation isn't equal to him. And I think that this is the reason why, in the opening of Paradise Lost, the demons are getting together and they're having this whole debate. Yeah, this is in book 2. They're having this whole debate about what they're going to do. And the background to this debate is precisely this problem of asymmetry. So Moloch, he says, my sentence is for open war. He doesn't seem to think that the demons can defeat God, but his premise is like, well, we're already, at the bottom of the lake of fire, so anything that happens from here is an improvement. And so, he says, well, if not victory, then revenge. So, Moloch seems to realize that there's no victory possible. That seems to be a key insight that was missing when the angels actually rebelled against God, but we'll leave that for another conversation. Then Belial, jumps into the conversation and he argues the points with Moloch. And Belial is kind of taking, the idea that we're in a bad situation, but it's a situation that could still get worse. And then we get Mammon. Mammon is kind of really interesting. He's the one that suggests that, we're down here, let's mine, let's sort of build up this place, and let's sort of, let's create our own. I think he's the one that suggests that, we should stay down here and, we should kind of make this place our own. And then we get Beelzebub, who's really speaking for Satan himself. And Beelzebub is the one that's like, okay, there's this other creation that's coming into being. Let's turn that creation against God. Starting with 345 in Book 2, there is a place, if ancient and prophetic fame in heaven err not, another world, the happy seed of some new race called man, about this time to be created like to us, though less in power and excellence, but favored more of him who rules above. So was his will pronounced among the gods, and by an oath that shook heaven's whole circumference confirmed. Thither let us bend our thoughts. And he goes on to say, let's see, by sudden onset, either with hellfire to waste his whole creation, or possess all as our own, and drive as we were driven, the puny inhabitants, or if not drive, seduce them to our party, that their God may prove their foe. That seems to be the motivation we're left with. If Milton wants to have a classical epic where you need some kind of conflict, and he wants to sort of import that literary form into a Christian context, we seem to have a problem because there's not a symmetry of power as there is between the Greeks and the Trojans. So the demons kind of debate the different possibilities in Book 2, and where they ultimately land is, let us seduce them to our party that their God may prove their foe. So the purpose is to sort of extend the rebellion and corruption into this new world. There's probably, I think there's enough there for drama. There's enough there to make that work.
It's interesting to me, and I think this supports the idea that Satan isn't just rebelling against the Son, he's also rebelling against God the Father, because it really seems to be something about contingency really bothers him, and that's the lie that he uses to seduce a third of the angels to his side, as he says, "You're self-begotten," which I take to mean you're basically necessary beings. You're not contingent beings. So there isn't this infinite gulf between you and the Son or the Father. We're all on the same metaphysical plane. You could almost read this as something a much later work written to criticize modern notions of autonomy based on that core conception of what Satan is about, and various dialogue that happens between Adam and Eve, I think, as well. But it seems to me that his conception of evil is trying to escape from the hierarchy in a certain way, that there is this set hierarchy, that you have a place in it. You have to make peace with where your place is in it. And evil is trying to get out of that. And particularly one vehicle of that evil is this notion of autonomy, is thinking of yourself as your own lawgiver, your own source of being. You imagine yourself not dependent on anything. That, I think, is the unifying conception of evil that underlies both of the falls described in this book. And I think it's conceivable that you could translate this into Augustinian terms, but it'd be more interesting because you'd have a different theory of evil if it turns out that this was a distinct theory of evil. But the idea of evil just as absence, or evil as inordinate desire, I think the desire to be outside of the hierarchy in this way, you could conceive as a kind of inordinate desire. So I'm mulling whether Milton has a unique theory of evil here, or whether it's he's just channeling Augustine.
I think that these are, the envy explanation that we were talking about before, I think is compatible with what you just said. So I really like your idea that in Milton's Paradise Lost, evil has something to do with a problematic desire to escape from the hierarchy. The only thing that I would probably want to insert into that sentence, and I don't know if you agree with this, but I think it has something to do with escaping from an ontological hierarchy. This isn't just political.
That is the kind of hierarchy I'm imagining.
Yes. Yeah, and I think Milton is giving you a lot of evidence that you can use to develop this idea. So let's look at book 5. When the angels sort of organize their rebellion, and Abadiel is the only one who doesn't go along with them, and he tries to refute Satan. Milton says in 5:850 that none seconded. So none of the demons, none of the evil angels, those who will become demons, none of them went along with Abadiel, who's sort of arguing for that, that hierarchy that you mentioned there. But listen to what Satan says. So spake the fervent angel, but his zeal none seconded, as out of season judged, or singular and rash, whereat rejoiced the apostate, and more haughty thus replied: that we were formed then, sayest thou, and the work of secondary hands, by task transferred from father to his son? Strange point and new. Doctrine which we would know whence learnt. Who saw when this creation was? Rememberest thou thy making, while the Maker gave thee being? We know no time when we were not as now. Know none before us. Self-begot, self-raised by our own quickening power. And he goes on there. But we know, because we've been paying attention to this the whole time, that everything is made through the Son, including that first sort of order of creation that we've been talking about. And Satan, when Abadiel says, yeah, all of you were made through the Son, Satan just finds that very, very unpalatable. And then he gives us that line about how he and the other demons are, quote unquote, self-begot, self-raised by our own quickening power. And he says, he asks of Abadiel, where did you get this? We would know whence this was learnt. Do you remember your making? We know no time when we were not as now. So the demons claim, like, we have no memory of our creation. We have no memory of this dependence relationship, or to use your words, Spencer, this hierarchy. So the demons are like, yeah, we're self-made. We're self-raised by our own power. So we, the readers, know that this is not the order of things in Milton's Paradise Lost. But here, we know something that Satan and the demons do not. They're much further down the ontological hierarchy than they understand that they are. But I think that passage from Book 5 really speaks to the concern that you've raised. And yes, I completely agree with you. I think that rebellion, that idea of let's get out of the ontological hierarchy is a big thing. And not only, like, let's get out of the ontological hierarchy, but, like, they deny the existence of the ontological hierarchy. Satan not only denies that he's made through the only begotten Son, but he seems to deny that he's a creature. He defines himself as self-begot and self-raised. So he really does seem to see himself as a kind of equal to God.
There's a brief passage, you'll recall, before Satan comes and tempts Eve, where Adam and Eve are talking, and they decide to split up. They decide to separate and each tend different parts of the garden. And I think we are invited to draw the conclusion, and that they each think like, well, because they had just been warned. They had just been warned that something bad was coming and they needed to watch out. It doesn't seem like Adam or Eve would have succumbed to Satan if they were together, but they decided to separate. So they were in a smaller way. So this is like the fall in heaven writ small. That's what Milton invites us to think about the fall, because he's drawing up all these symmetries. They're overestimating their capacities and their ability to be socially independent, that they can withstand temptations without society based on their own capacities. They each think themselves capable of doing this despite being warned by the angels. And so I think, once again, this is they're kind of promoting themselves in the hierarchy, maybe to angelic status or something in their own minds.
So maybe we could walk through this one for a second. I think, I agree with everything that you have said about this passage. So, Satan, when he first comes to Eve, he's like kneeling, while she's sleeping, and then he gets thrown out. The angels find him. But then he comes back in book 9. And in verse 180, line 180, like a black mist low creeping, he held on his midnight search where soonest he might find the serpent. Him fast sleeping soon he found, in labyrinth of many around self rolled, his head the midst well stored with subtle wiles, not yet in horrid shade or dismal den, nor nocent yet, but on the grassy herb, fearless unfeared he slept. In at his mouth the devil entered. So we've got Satan in the serpent as of about, 185, 6, 7, 8. As of one.
And may I just point out,
Yeah,
that this is another symmetry here. You have a parallel incarnation.
that I had not thought of that. That's actually really interesting. That's very interesting. Yeah. Since we're talking about, Satan's various guises, I just want to mention, your comment, Satan's envy of the sort of ontological status of Jesus, and maybe also of God the Father, certainly also of God the Father, is, because of that envy, there's a certain irony to the way that Satan goes about this. When he, first enters Eden, he's I think a cormorant, this sort of giant bird that perches in the tree of life. And then when he kneels in front of Eve's bed, he's described as having taken the form of a toad. And now he's literally entered a snake. So for someone who believes that he is the sort of ontological equivalent of God, he's spending an awful lot of time in these sort of lower animal forms. That's something that I thought was really interesting. Obviously, some of that is in the Genesis account itself, Genesis 3, the snake, at least in its patristic and medieval interpretation. But all the other stuff, the bird, and I guess we should also add, the black mist. If he's taking the form of a black mist, that's not even an animal. That's like an inanimate object. So it's interesting that in order to effectuate his rebellion, he's having to become more and more irrational in his outward forms. My question is this. Milton makes a big deal out of the fact that they're not working together. I did not have a chance to try to chase this down. I don't know where this comes from. And I guess the Genesis account, it does sort of imply that when the serpent approaches Eve, that Adam is not there. And maybe Milton is just sort of like developing that idea a little bit, like giving us a little bit more. But this whole sort of conversation that they have, this is really something that is coming from Milton. I was interested in it, but it's interesting because what comes later when they eat the fruit is the result of satanic corruption and suggestion. But as far as I can tell, their decision to split up seems to exist just at the level of, maybe imprudence. Are they? Do you remember? Do they have any instructions from the angels who are guarding them that they're not supposed to split up? That could be something, but I couldn't. I
I
couldn't
don't
remember anything.
I don't recall that.
Okay.
Then that would have been disobedience right there.
Hmm.
Not something on a ladder leading to
Yeah.
disobedience. But imprudence with something like this seems like maybe more than just imprudence.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I don't know. I see that I read that as Milton clearly telling me this is the real fulcrum. This is the real point at which it tips over into something they no longer have an appropriate amount of control over.
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
Yeah, no, I think that that's right. I mean, the background about whether they're disobeying the angels or something, we'd have to sort of go further into the text to try to find passages about that. But yeah, regardless, it's at least imprudent, the decision to split up. And then what happens next is the actual fall. Did you want to say something about the actual fall?
well, I'll tell you, I loved reading that passage. It was so compelling. And yet, as I'm reflecting on it later, I wanted to hear more about, because you hear about how the earth shakes and, like very theatrical. It's like a scene from a movie that, immediately something bad has happened. But I want to know what this is doing to them internally, what goes on in Eve's mind, how it's transformed by this fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. How what happens with Adam? Do all these moral intuitions come rushing in? What happens exactly? And we're not given that. We're given them from from the outside, and you get a little bit of that where they make love again, but now it's like there's some element of lust there, but it's not very clear what has happened to them internally. And I kind of wished there was some more elaboration on that.
That's really interesting. I really this that hadn't occurred to me, but I guess I'm sympathetic to your complaint here. I mean, it is an incredibly long chapter, but Milton, I think you're right. He does kind of keep it. He does keep it pretty external. I mean, some of the moves that I found really interesting. I mean, they know the covenant. They know Adam knows what's going to happen once Eve tells him she's eaten the fruit. And I really liked this line when Adam says, "Our state cannot be severed. We are one flesh. To lose thee were to lose myself." And then he continues in 971. To undergo with me one guilt, one crime, if any be, of tasting this fair fruit, whose virtue, for of good still good proceeds, direct or by occasion hath presented this happy trial of thy love, which else so eminently never had been known. Milton tells us that Eve takes the fruit. She says in 679, O sacred, wise, and wisdom-giving plant, mother of science, now I feel thy power, before she eats it. So she's eating the fruit because of the suggestion of Satan and because of what she hopes the fruit will give her. And it's interesting. I mean, she, really sort of foregrounds knowledge, and that's in Genesis 3 as well. I really thought, I really thought Milton was doing something really interesting here when he has Adam eat the fruit, almost for like there's a kind of romanticism to it, like
It's like
Eve is
Romeo
going
and
to.
Juliet. He must have
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
he was an
Yeah.
admirer of Shakespeare, and I'm sure he adopted this.
Oh yeah, I wonder if that's actually there. That's fascinating. I mean, we could research it. I'm sure
Well,
somebody's written about that. But
but
yeah, I mean, this,
I
you
think
know,
what he was my way of reading this is that there's this one sin of misidentifying your place in the hierarchy, seeing yourself as self-begotten, self-created, and this is reflected differently in different individuals. Maybe for Eve, she wants the knowledge. In a sense, Adam is maybe this is the thing. Maybe there's a male female hierarchy here, and Adam is the more knowledgeable, the more intellectual. In fact, he's warned about this by the angels that you need to get your head out of the clouds and start thinking more practically at one point. And maybe Eve wants to be at least the equal of Adam, maybe something higher. Whereas Adam, he's prioritizing Eve over God, and he doesn't know. And we don't, in fact, know what would happen if Adam had refused the fruit. Would God have made him another mate? Would he be there alone? Would Eve die alone? Would he have come up with some way of Eve to redeem herself and get back in the garden? We don't know, but he was afraid of being separated from her, and he made Eve like his idol. So that they're two different trajectories of one root sin, I think, is what he's suggesting.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I'll buy that. Yeah. I have a lot of questions based on a few things that came up in the literature. I mean, I know of some scholars. I haven't really had an opportunity to wade very deeply into this, but a number of scholars have read Adam's role in the fall, Eve's role in the fall, alongside Milton's pro-divorce tract. And the kind of theme, the word that comes up in what I was reading is the sort of theme of mutuality in the relationships between the sexes. I don't know if Milton means by mutuality what we would mean in the present. In some ways, Milton's depiction of the fall kind of seems like a throwback. If you look at like the tradition of painting this scene, I can't give you an artist's name, but I mean there are artists who've painted this like, Eve is enthusiastically biting into the fruit and Adam is like trying to stop her. None of that is in the text, and Milton is not doing any of those things. Milton does, however, ascribe different motivations to Adam and to Eve. And I was kind of left with the impression that, Eve is eating the fruit because of, Gnostic motivations, desire for knowledge, envy, all of these other things. Adam, on the other hand, at least in Milton, Adam seems to eat the fruit out of charity. So that, whatever will happen to Eve also happens to him. This kind of like Romeo and Juliet thing that you mentioned. I see Milton kind of exculpating Adam here a little bit. I didn't see, and maybe I missed it, but I didn't see a whole lot of discussion about his motivation in the later books of Paradise Lost. At least I didn't see the discussion of it that I was looking for.
Well, God does chastise him. He says, so is Eve your God then? But I think we are meant to view him, there's something more honorable in what he does. I think we're meant to think that. I wanted to ask you a bit about the fall. In particular, this whole thing isn't a setup, I swear, but I wanted to push you on Mormon views about the fall. I don't know what your familiarity is with this.
Honestly, not much. But I was having a conversation. You remember my friend from Christ in the Desert, Brother Bede?
Yeah.
So he and I were having a conversation last night, and I mentioned him. I was doing this podcast with you, and he, without my saying anything, started talking about like the Mormon reception of Paradise Lost. And apparently, there's a really substantial interest in the poem from Mormon theologians because of some of the things that Milton writes. So maybe this will segue into what you wanted to say.
I didn't know that. But the Mormon view of the fall is different in that the fall was supposed to happen. It was supposed to happen. And Satan, on the Mormon view, was actually moving God's plan along without knowing it. It's a familiar role for Satan to be in. C.S. Lewis even mentions this in his book on Paradise Lost, that he ends up being a tool for the divine anyway. But the thought was, no, they were supposed to have knowledge of good and evil, and they were supposed to figure out that they were supposed to have it. And so, yes, they were commanded not to eat the fruit of knowledge of good and evil, but they were also supposed to figure out that's really what they were supposed to do all along. So they often will make the distinction between a sin and a transgression. And so this was a transgression, in as much as they broke one of God's commandments, but they were supposed to figure out that that was not a commandment they were meant to keep anyway. That's their view. Let me tell you why I find it attractive. Because it does seem to me that what would be the point of creating human beings to begin at all if they're not to have knowledge of good and evil? Why not just fill up Eden with happy otters or something like that? Why are there human beings there capable of knowledge of good and evil if they were not supposed to have it? And the other thing is, clearly this was meant to be a choice. He didn't have to put a tree there and tell them not to eat the fruit. This was meant to be, they were meant to have the choice to disobey. He went out of his way to make it possible for them to break that commandment. What C.S. Lewis says is that, well, that gives them the opportunity to have obedience, right? There's just one commandment. It's super minimal. All you have to do is keep it. And so there's a sort of a mini soul-making theodicy for what would explain why God would put the tree in the garden and tell them not to eat the fruit. But I think once you go down the path of like God wants humans to develop their capacities and to develop virtues, all that points toward them leaving the garden, because even if you can cultivate obedience by just not eating the fruit, you can't really develop courage or any of the other things that get mentioned in soul-making theodicies, right, in a paradise where you just have to not eat the one fruit. So I'm pretty compelled by the idea that, yes, that was supposed to happen. Not just that it was a bad thing that God redeemed, but it was part of the plan all along.
Gosh, there's a lot there. Okay, so, in my tradition, in Roman Catholicism, there's a well-known expression, "O felix culpa," "O happy fault," which is part of a really well-known text, the Exultet, which is sung at the Easter Vigil every year at the super solemn liturgical commemoration of the resurrection. And that idea, "O felix culpa," "O happy fault," I think, I can't remember the Latin, but I think in the English it says like, "O necessary sin of Adam," something like that. And there is this idea that, it's as a result of Adam's transgression, God becomes man, as St. Athanasius says, so that man might become God. In Roman Catholic eschatology, and in the sources for Roman Catholic eschatology, etc., the final state of humanity, like as a last thing, isn't just a restoration of Eden. It goes well beyond what you see in Eden. So in that sense, it's sensible to refer to Adam's transgression as a felix culpa, as a happy fault. Having said that, off the top of my head, and I'm not an expert on patristic interpretations of Genesis 3 by any stretch of the imagination, but I don't know. I think it's one thing to say that, Adam's sin is a happy fault, the sin of Adam and Eve. Like, I think it's one thing to say that, God permits evil so that he can draw a greater good from it, which is basically what the O felix, culpa theology is all about. I think it's one thing to say that I think it's one thing to say that God permits evil in order to draw a greater good for it. That idea, for instance, like it's all over the letter to the Romans. I think it's another thing to say that God actively planned and willed for Adam and Eve to disobey him. Like here we get into very, very murky territory where the distinctions become very, very subtle very quickly, because we will have to depart. If we really want to go into sort of the theological tradition on this, we're going to have to leave aside Milton's, in my opinion, a little bit too overly schematic, a little bit too neat distinction between divine foreknowledge and predestination. Because a problem for Milton, I think, is if God foreknows something, and if God is simple, then what is the difference between what God foreknows and what God wills? This is a question, I think, for the theologian of predestination. And there are a lot of questions like this that come up. In general, if you look at a passage like Romans, 1:24 to 1:28, where the idolaters are kind of being handed over by God to various sins as a penalty for their idolatry. If you look at patristic and medieval Roman Catholic, what are now considered Roman Catholic interpretations of those passages, they'll say that God is allowing those people to sort of continue on the trajectory that they're on. So there's a kind of like moral logic from going from idolatry to going to the other things that are mentioned in Romans, 1:24 to 1:28, or whatever the verses are. The Protestant view tends to be more like God isn't just allowing that. God is actually kind of like giving you a push. He's not just letting you get into the boat. He's like, pushing the canoe out into the river. And those two models I think are really relevant for understanding what you're talking about right now. Like, is God like telling Adam and Eve that he doesn't want them to disobey the covenant, but really he does want them to disobey the covenant? Like, is there a hidden motivation on God's part? Yeah, that to me is the part where I get a little bit nervous. The traditional sort of Roman Catholic solution to this is to distinguish between what we now call the ordaining will of God and the permitting will of God. So God doesn't ordain that they should eat the fruit in disobedience of the covenant, but he permits it, and then he's able to draw good from the evil of their disobedience. That's the tradition that I'm most familiar and comfortable with. But if you want to take predestination, if you want to like set the predestination setting to a maximum, you can find a lot of people who will go there.
Well, I don't know. I think this is distinct from predestination. I'm just thinking, is it really what God intended, that everybody be in the garden forever? Like, because there's this whole other way, that there's the free will response to the problem of evil, which Milton is clearly drawing on. Then there's also the soul building, which is that, look, we need there to be evil to develop various, virtues, character traits, and there needs to be a lot of bad stuff in the world for us to develop them and to grow. And if you take that idea seriously, then it seems like there are good reasons why you wouldn't want everyone in a paradisical garden forever, or why you wouldn't want to put everyone in a giant bouncy ball, inflatable castle or something like that. You're not going to develop any of the major virtues. So if that's a part of the answer to the argument from evil, it seems like it's also a reason why God would not want all of humanity to remain in the garden forever.
It's an interesting idea. I've heard this before. I have some questions about it. I mean, so I think it's one thing to say that there are possibilities of growth as a result of the fall. I think it's another thing to ask about whether God willed that. I think it's one thing to say, like, that some good things, came of the fall, the Felix culpa argument. It's another thing to say that the fall was necessary for, for humanity to progress in a psychological sense, or maturity or something like that. I think there's some sort of patristic support for some of these ideas. I am, I'm reluctant to sort of try to invoke them, because a number of the fathers I just think have just fundamentally different ideas of what's going on in the fall than Milton does, and it's awkward to kind of import some of their sort of their reasoning about its purposes and so on into Milton's framework, which is really, really different. But I guess it's so clearly the expulsion described as a penalty in Genesis 3. It's not described as a program of self-improvement. It might turn out to be a program of self-improvement because of divine grace and so on and so forth. But like, I'm reluctant to sort of take a reading that says, oh, this is what they really needed, was to leave the garden. This is what was good for them all along. I just don't think that's what the story is about. But I mean, but I've heard this sort of thing, and I don't think it's just limited to Mormonism. I mean, I think there's a certain I think there's a kind of self-helpy, flavor to this way of reading it. But again, in the sources that I spend the most time with, the expulsion is sort of described as punitive. There's a lot of of the theology of exile going on, especially in the Old Testament. And it kind of makes hash of salvation history to read exile as something good. Like another one. Does somebody want to argue that, the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians, which results, in the captivity of the survivors for 40 years in Babylon? I mean, are we now going to argue that that was, that was good for them? I don't know. It's just like I understand those ideas are out there, but they're not really part of the exegetical tradition that I'm most familiar with.
That's fair enough. That's fair enough. I do find it interesting that, I'll propose like, oh, like there are these intrinsically good states, and it seems like you couldn't have them in a purely paradisical garden, and so that's a reason for thinking that God would not have wanted that to happen. Well, your way is thinking is go back to the text, go back to the tradition, and yeah, just very, very different responses to these sorts of questions.
Yeah, I mean, I'm, we didn't really talk about this, but my role here at St. Anselm College, I'm basically an historical theologian. I teach some Bible classes, biblical theology and New Testament. I also teach early church, and in early church, we read Matthew's gospel, and then we read, selections from patristic commentaries on Matthew's gospel. So my, Jean Leclerc, the author of the famous study, The Love of Learning and the Desire for God, famous reflection on monastic culture. Leclerc writes that for the medieval monks, the patristic commentaries on the Bible were inseparable from the pages of sacred scripture. So there's an entire sort of thought world that gets sort of transmitted here. And I spend a lot of time in that thought world because it's very enriching. And while the idea that we're talking about right now, I don't think it's entirely absent from that thought world. It's definitely like at most a minority report. Given the fact that we agree that it's going beyond Felix Culpa theology, there's something else that's motivating that. But anyway, I mean that's my answer. Ask a different theologian, you get a different answer.
No, I was commenting more generally on just our different approaches to the questions, because I think a lot of philosophers will have the reaction, why are you just going back to what the patristics say? Why not just like, yeah, where I'm sort of freely making these a priori arguments based on some things I assume to be good and what I assume a perfect being would do, which would be to promote those goods and so on and so forth. And you're going back to the tradition, and I wonder if there's like an underlying epistemology that explains that we're our own intuitions about these things and knowledge of God's intentions and motivations are so cloudy that we best stick close to what has been developed by the tradition, which is more reliable than any of our individual minds.
So maybe less an epistemic norm than an ecclesial norm. If you look at the in Roman Catholicism, we recognize 21 different ecumenical councils, important moments of magisterial teaching in the tradition. The most recent one was in the 1960s, Vatican II. Vatican II had an important teaching document on divine revelation, title of which is De Verbum, the Word of God. And the council asked the church, given the growing prevalence of scientific methods of Bible interpretation, the council affirmed some things that the popes had been saying since 1943 or so, allowing Roman Catholic Bible scholars to use scientific methods of biblical interpretation, the so-called historical critical method. This is in paragraph 12 of De Verbum. But the other thing that De Verbum 12 said was that authentically Catholic interpretations of the Bible have to be anchored in three things. One, the unity of the testaments. So the idea that the Old Testament and the New Testament are telling a unified story. They're giving us a kind of unified view of salvation history. The second thing is the interpretation should be in accord with the living interpretation of the entire church, which means that and this I think speaks most directly to what you've said. It's not that like Saint Augustine or Saint Irenaeus or Saint Thomas Aquinas. It's not that any of those voices from the past have the decisive word in what a scriptural passage, quote unquote, means, but it does mean that those are sort of privileged interpreters that give us some boundaries in which we can work. And the third is the analogy of faith, meaning the interpretation of the Bible in the Roman Catholic tradition always takes place within the context of the doctrines and dogmas of the faith, and there's always a relationship between between divine revelation transmitted by Scripture and divine revelation as transmitted by the theological tradition and the liturgical tradition and so on and so forth, because all of that in Roman Catholicism is considered divine revelation. Or at least a channel for transmitting divine revelation. And that's very different, say, in Protestant Christianity, where scripture is a form of divine revelation, but tradition quite emphatically is not. For most Protestants, I think that would be true. So again, I don't think it's an epistemic limitation, but I do think it's the right word is probably methodological. And you're also talking to a theologian who's very, very specifically professionally committed to, reading and remaining in dialogue with ancient and medieval interpretations of the Bible. My sense is that while people think that a lot of it might be sort of hidebound, the fathers and the medievals, it often seems like a fresh take. There was a time in church history when all of this would have been much better known than it is now. So anyway, I mean, yeah, I think there's a difference in method, and certainly like between philosophers and theologians, there are important methodological differences, and that doesn't mean that the philosophers are wrong. It just means that there's different ways of approaching the same question. Okay, so Brother Dunstan's closing thoughts. I think in looking at this structure that Milton has given us, the angelic fall, a creation of angels, the existence of heaven, but an angelic fall especially, which predates the creation of what we see around us, the physical universe that's getting created in Genesis, beginning in the first verses of Genesis. And the question is, why is Milton giving us this? Because this is central to Paradise Lost. I mean, we're opening with the angels in hell, and then we're kind of building out from there. So this isn't an incidental image or an incidental theological idea in Paradise Lost. I think this is structural for the poem, and I'd like to propose, and I'm not saying this is you won't find this elsewhere, but this was my reading of it as I was reading it this time, is that. As I've kind of mentioned a couple times, I think that the deeper structure of the poem for me is the respective experiences and responses to exile from paradise or from heaven, first by Satan, and then contrastively Adam. And I think Milton is really giving us Adam as an exemplar. Adam, he thinks, is getting this right. For Milton, both Satan and Adam are free. No one is compelled to act as they do. Milton makes that exhaustively clear. Totally respected if Milton's account of human freedom is unsatisfactory by contemporary philosophical standards. That's obviously an important finding for a philosopher. Adam's response to exile, in Paradise Lost 11:525, I yield it just. A really important statement from Adam. You never see Satan say anything like that. And then, we get in 12:585 to 87, then wilt thou not be loath to leave this paradise, but shall possess a paradise within thee, happier far. Contrast that with the passage that we talked about before, when Satan says that he carries hell around within himself. So Satan is carrying hell around within himself. Adam is carrying paradise within himself. I just think this is all structural for Milton. We're supposed to sort of see these two responses to exile, and if we ourselves experience some form of exile, we're supposed to choose as Adam does rather than Satan does. But that's my reading of Paradise Lost. I think even though Milton is pretty liberal in his use of heterodox theology, he puts it to a very, very good use in this poem. So closing thoughts from you, Spencer.
Well, I don't have an overarching thing to say about it, but I do want to draw attention to one passage. This is Book 2, line 496, where we see that the demons have at least a shadow of virtue in contrast sometimes to human beings. And he's no doubt thinking of the English Civil War, which he had lived through and was on the Republican side. He says, "Oh, shame to man, devil with devil damned, firm concord holds. Men only disagree of creatures rational, though under hope of heavenly grace and God proclaiming peace, yet live in hatred, enmity, and strife among themselves, and levy cruel wars, wasting the earth each other to destroy, as if, which might induce us to accord, men had not hellish foes, and now besides, that day and night for his destruction wait."
Nice. Yeah, a beautiful passage. Certainly an application, as you mentioned, to the political circumstances of Milton's day, but certainly something that here transcends those political circumstances.
Indeed.
Yeah, I mean, he gives us. I understand why Blake makes the point that he makes about Milton taking the side of Satanite. I think that, the way I would put it is, I think Milton shows tremendous understanding and sympathy toward the ability of rational creatures to persevere in pride and envy and ignorance. Even though I don't think he's taking that side any more than he's affirming those vices. I think he shows tremendous sort of a willingness to show compassion toward the demons, even though he's he's obviously pretty critical of them. But that's a nice passage for that.
I think it's clear here that he takes evil seriously, but he's ultimately warning us against it. That, we're not so different from the demons, and the ways that we're different from the demons are not altogether flattering to us even. So watch out, humanity.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's great. Watch out, humanity. It's a nice way of putting it. So yeah. So what do you think? Did he justify God's ways to men?
I don't think he succeeds. I don't think he succeeds in that. I think that the fundamental conundrums of free will are just he doesn't really get past them. But what he does do other things. He shows that Satan himself wants to assume the top of another hierarchy, even though he rejects hierarchy. He shows some interesting things about you try to reject you try to reject goodness, and the best you can do is end up emulating it in a pale shadow of its original form. I think he does some interesting things here, even if he doesn't provide us with a theodicy in the end.